Hello, my name is Christopher Michael Brooke, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the book Instant Rapport by Michael Brooks, not by me. Brooks claims that people interpret the world around them primarily in terms of images, sounds, or feelings, and that by tapping into the representational systems that people use to think, we can place ourselves in rapport with them and aid our communication with them. Now, according to Brooks, there are three systems or modalities, so-called, that we use to think about the world. First is visual, or thinking in terms of images. The second is auditory, thinking in terms of sounds. And finally, you have kinesthetic, which would be thinking in terms of feelings or emotions. And according to Brooks, most people, well, actually all people, pretty much have all three of these particular ways of thinking, but one of the three is usually going to be the dominant one that's used more often than not. Overall, the majority of the population tends to think in terms of visual or images. The second largest percentage of the population is usually a kinesthetic, or somebody who thinks in terms of feelings, emotions. And then the smallest area of the population, usually about 20%, are generally auditory thinkers who think about the world around them in terms of sounds. And actually, to back this up, I have a quote from Visual, Auditory, Kinesthetic Learning Styles and Their Impacts on English Language Teaching by Abbas Gilakjani. And according to Gilakjani, 20 to 30% of school-age children appear to be auditory learners, 40% are visual learners, and about 30% are tactile or kinesthetic learners. And in this particular study, they were looking at school-age children to determine the best way to communicate academic information to them effectively. So, according to Brooks, it is possible to determine the primary representational system that somebody uses. So again, most people have all three and use all three all the time, but one of the three is generally going to be the more dominant and the most used. According to Brooks, there are two ways in order to determine somebody's primary system. Firstly is through listening. You can listen to the way a person speaks. If somebody says things like, I see what you're saying there, or that's clear to me, I can't see myself doing that, that's usually a good indication that they're probably a visual thinker. On the contrary, if there's somebody who says things a lot like, that feels good to me, or I just get that, or I can't grasp what you're saying, they're probably going to be generally a kinesthetic thinker. The second way that you can determine the primary modality somebody uses is through what's called an eye-accessing cue. Believe it or not, our brains are actually hardwired to move our eyes in a specific direction when we are thinking a certain way. And I'll actually zoom in here a little bit so I can show you. But in general, when people think in terms of images, they move their eyes up, like that. When people think in terms of sounds, they move their eyes to the right or to the left. And when people think in terms of feelings or emotions, they move their eyes in one specific direction, which is down and to their right, or your left as you're looking at them. Zoom back out here. But overall, that's pretty much standard for just about anybody you might meet. So, and actually, I've got a quote here to confirm that. A quote from Eye Movement as an Indicator of Sensory Components in Thought by Michael Buckner. And he says here that inter-rater agreement supports the NLP claim that specific eye movement patterns exist and that trained observers can reliably identify them. In this particular study, they were looking at various claims of NLP, or neuro-linguistic programming, which is where all this information ultimately comes from. And they were looking specifically at eye-accessing cues, and they did apparently find evidence to support the fact that they do exist and can be reliably interpreted. Something else that Brooks talks about is the idea of cascading, or what he calls cascading, which is the idea that when we think, we tend to kind of bounce around in terms of how we think about what's around us or what we're thinking of. We might think in images at one second, and the next moment be thinking about how those images felt, and then a second later how they sound. And as we change the way we're thinking about that, our eye accessing cues, or the way we move our eyes, will actually change according to that too. So 1 second a person might be thinking in images and looking up. The second, or the moment after that, they might be thinking in terms of sounds and look to their right. And then they might look down in order to see how that particular thought felt to them. And the way this particular system works when you're observing it is that, again, most people will use all three of these modes of thought, and so their eyes will kind of bounce all over. But in general, one of these particular movements will generally appear far more frequently than the others, and the person will tend to stay in that particular eye motion pattern longer than the others. And that's usually a good sign or a good indicator of their particular dominant modality. So what does all this mean? Well, if you know somebody's primary way of thinking, if you know their primary modality for thinking, you can communicate in a modality that people naturally understand better. Example, if somebody generally thinks in terms of images, you might, well actually generally you will be better able to communicate with them by communicating in terms of images. And by that I don't necessarily mean like sign language or showing them a picture, but if you talk in a way that your words convey images more than they convey feelings or sounds, you're likely going to communicate better with them. Same for an auditory person. If they think in terms of sounds and you use a lot of sound evoking words as you speak, things like "I hear you" or "that sounds good to me," and there are a whole lot of other examples too. But generally, you'll find that you can communicate better with them because you're speaking their language, so to speak. You're speaking in a way that they naturally understand a little better. And this actually goes back to message planning, thinking about how you're trying to get a message across before you just kind of open your mouth and say whatever comes to you. So, the second useful bit of information that comes along with this is that speaking in a person's specific dominant modality is a good way to build rapport with them or build a feeling of closeness and familiarity. According to Jessica L. Locken and her article "Using Non-Conscious Behavioral Mimicry to Create Affiliation and Rapport," results suggest that behavioral mimicry may be part of a person's repertoire of behaviors used non-consciously when there is a desire to create rapport. What she's saying is that unconsciously, when we're trying to fit in with people or be like them, we tend to mimic them. And matching your representational system to somebody else's primary representational system is a form of mimicry. If you're naturally an auditory person and you're talking to a visual person and you change the way you're talking in order to be more visual in terms of your language, you are mimicking their representational system. And you'll probably find that, first of all, you communicate better, and secondly, they tend to just kind of feel a similarity towards you. You're somebody who thinks like them. But again, people will kind of unconsciously, whether they really realize it or not, they're going to feel connected with you as somebody who thinks about the world and interprets the world the way that they do, which will help you aid your communication and also kind of just help you make friends and influence people and be like Dale Carnegie. And Brooks goes on to offer some advanced techniques for creating this rapport, but that would kind of fall outside the scope of this presentation on communication. So I'll leave those for you to read about yourself. In summary, there are three modalities of thought. People tend to think in images, sounds, and feelings, with one of them being dominant over the others. And it is possible to determine the primary system through observation that people will use to think. And then once you know this primary system, you can match the person's primary modality in order to enhance communication and place yourself in good rapport with them. And that is the end of my presentation here. If that were actually my book, I would say buy my book, but it's not my book, so I will say eat lots of ice cream and have a good day. And thank you for watching.